Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you for listening.
I want to report that I took my daughter to England. We spent 3 days in London, and we did wild things because we've done so many normal things that we did. We went to Sir Richard Francis Burton's grave in Mortlake. He was one of the searchers for the source of the Nile. We went to Abbey Road. Partly for you, David, on the 50th anniversary.
Have you listened to the 50th anniversary yet?
I have not.
You should.
I need to get it.
Yeah.
But, of course, it's the 50th anniversary of the release of Abbey Road.
Your favorite Beatle
and
record.
the day before we were there, the remaining Beatles, Paul and Ringo, were there on the zebra stripe at Abbey Road. So we went the next day because we didn't want to be part of that mob. But there were thousands of people there the day that we went, and we took photographs, and it was great because it was like if you've seen Let It Be. Mm-hmm. So eventually the cops come and they're trying to get people off the road, and they're saying, they're being very stern that yes, we understand, but there is traffic here in London and it must move, and you're in the way, someone's going to get hurt. And then people would just like, okay, officer, and then right back into the road. Photographs, video, people from every nation in the world there, and they're bowing to the studio, and they're remembering that, this doesn't happen with many artists. But the Beatles, maybe Dylan, they're a handful that have that iconic, were central to a way the world saw itself at a certain time, and the Beatles are the supreme in that. And I know we've had this discussion about how important the
Words
Beatles have been
music,
to us.
3 chords and the truth.
And so that was great. And then we went to Oxford and got her settled, bought all the pillows and the blankets and the things that one buys.
We start this week's show with a complimentary letter about her.
And she was on the program just before we left.
And her parents.
It was, and people have been writing to me saying, "Oh, how hard it must be to be an empty nester and to leave her behind and all that." Not a bit. I was thrilled. I couldn't be happier for her. I'm just thrilled for her. This is her time, and I keep saying to her in our FaceTime.
She does listen to the podcast.
Well, she listens when she's on.
Uh-huh.
Don't exaggerate, honey. But but I keep saying to her, "Drink this in. Keep a journal."
Yeah,
I wish I had.
Too.
Keep a journal.
Yeah.
I'm writing to her every day in hopes that maybe she'll get the hint and write back, because I want her to record her experiences, because I have to say those 4 years for me were, without question, the most
and you didn't keep
significant of my life. I have letters and journals, but it's all scattered in my, the usual way.
This week we do answer a bunch of questions.
Some of it very hard to hear.
It was a little tough on you this week, but I thought you should get
moved by some of this.
Yeah, especially the letter from the woman. What was her name?
Amy Jo Townley.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I take it all very seriously, and sometimes I
hope she hears this.
She will hear it,
and maybe responds to us.
Well, she couldn't be more right.
Yeah, she's right. She's dead right. But change is going to come, but it might not be quick enough for her.
Senator Dorgan, former North Dakota senator,
he's been on the news a lot lately.
He has a new book coming out.
Oh, does he?
And he told me about it. I had a conversation with him last week, and it's about a young Native American woman. She had a desperate childhood, just horrible.
Oh, I remember this now. Yeah.
And then she went into foster care,
right.
and things weren't much better. And he actually talked about her plight when she was an infant on the floor of the United States Senate.
You suppose he'd come on the Jefferson Hour and tell us about that book?
I think he might.
Yeah,
and
we should
then
talk to him.
She grew up not knowing this, but at some point she was kind of Googling around, and she found that a U.S. senator had spoken of her plight on the floor of the United States Senate, calling for greater national concern about the plight of young Native Americans. And she contacted him. And they now know each other, and he's done some things to help her in different ways. Yeah. Anyway, it's a book about this. Extraordinary. This is not the usual former U.S. Senator kind of book about, I did this and I did that. Byron Dorgan of Regent, North Dakota, a prairie populist Democrat, not liberal, but center-left, I'd say. He had and has a very deep and passionate concern for Native Americans, and he made that one of his signatures as a United States Senator. When it didn't do him any political good to do it, he did it because he believed that it was right. That's so That's so important.
Well, we'll have to look into that. I'd like to find out the name of his book. Anyway, you got a plane to catch.
I'm going to Paris. I'm never coming back.
Thank you very much for an enjoyable show, sir.
Thank you, David. And to all of our listeners, send in your thoughts. We do take every letter seriously, and believe me, even if they bruise, they're useful, and they're appreciated, and we don't take anything lightly, except Chrysler.
And thank you for listening. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good to see you, sir.
It is a pleasure to be here with you, my friend. We are not in the barn because the barn is at sub-zero blizzard-like conditions.
But what do you care? Because tomorrow you shall be leaving for the south of France.
I've been reading about this, David. I'm reading all the letters involving Jefferson in France. They're fascinating, and they're some of the most important letters that he ever wrote. But one of the sort of things that comes up again and again is how difficult travel was and how difficult communication was. So he says to Madison, I'm sending you some books. These are books that I'm presuming you might want. There's really no way for me to charge them to you, so I'm just keeping a list, and then I want you to do some favors for me in Virginia, and at some future time we'll go over this and make sure that, but I'm certainly in your debt, and I want to make sure that I'm not buying anything for you that you don't want. And I'm sending them to northern France with this courier who happens to be going there in hopes that there will be a packet boat that's going back to Boston or Philadelphia at some point. And when it gets there, I've got instructions that it will be brought by carriage or by along the Chesapeake down to Norfolk, and then you'll have to hire a wagon to get them from Richmond to Montpelier. And you just think, oh my goodness, that the tediousness of travel and of communication. Jefferson and his daughter crossed the Atlantic in 19 days, which was super fast. And they're in this tiny little yacht. They actually had to crawl into their cave-like cabin on this boat. Martha, his daughter, was seasick for much of the time. We take for granted. Tomorrow morning I'm going to get up and I'm going to go in a vehicle to an airport. They're going to look at my passport and they're going to pass me through and take my luggage. And then before that calendar day is out, that 24-hour period is out, I will be in Paris looking at Notre Dame or the Eiffel Tower or one of the statues of Jefferson that are there. And I can send an email or FaceTime my daughter instantaneously at any time, anywhere on earth, free. We take for granted this world that we live in.
Well, continuing my poor job of being a semi-permanent, I have not set you up properly. There are those who probably do not know why you are going to France.
Well, that's a good question. I love France. Jefferson said every man's first country is his own, and every rational being's second country must be France. I would not actually say that. I would say Britain is everyone's second country, at least for me, or Greece. But I love France, and I'm leading a cultural tour. So the Jefferson Hour tours.
Setup, yes.
We do Lewis and Clark tours. We're going to Cuba on February 8th. There's still, I think, one or two places for that. We do these winter encampments out at Loxa Lodge west of Missoula. We do the every other year John Steinbeck tour. We do Jefferson in Virginia and so on. But for many years, people have been saying, when will you lead another group to Jefferson in France? And so I actually leave tomorrow in mid-October with a group of about 20 Jeffersonians. And we're going to spend 10 days in Paris and Bordeaux and in the south of France.
And you will take many photographs to share with us, I'm assuming.
I'll be sending back photographs that we can post and little nightly updates.
So we're pre-recording this program, so when you get back, we'll do our next show. You can report in and tell us how the trip went.
If I come back.
Oh, yeah,
I can't go to England. That's Brexit. I'm here in this nation, which is in a constitutional crisis.
Speaking of England, we had planned this week to do something that we do regularly, perhaps not often enough, and we have a backlog of letters here in front of us.
Out of character listener mail.
Right. If you're interested in the Jefferson Hour, go to jeffersonhour.com. You can find out all sorts of things about the show. You can support the show, which we like very much, but you can also ask President Jefferson a question or send a letter to Clay to ask a question, and we get some great responses. And we love the criticism, and we are humbled by the praise. But this letter, which I have in front of you now, I needed to bring up first. And your daughter, Catherine, was in and did a couple of shows about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And this is one of the many letters that we got about her that I wanted you to read.
I will, but let me preface it by saying I was in the studio when we did those programs, and they were unscripted, as always, spontaneous. And about halfway through, I thought, hey, I produced a smart aleck. I have a whippersnapper. She has some smart alecky irreverences, which had to come from somewhere, and they couldn't have come from me. They could not have come from me.
Uh-huh.
So who to blame?
How do you figure that?
I'm just saying, she was so quick on her feet, and she skewered me 3 or 4 times. I was laughing out loud at the capacity of her wit to be irreverent.
It's simply that you didn't expect it coming from her.
I thought,
so
filial.
Your guard was down.
How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have.
She did call me a sycophant at one point.
Yeah, that's why you wouldn't even be on the show. You were hiding in.
So this letter came from J.F. Stover. Would you like to read it, sir?
Mr. Stover says, I'm enjoying so much listening to you and Catherine interact. My life is enriched by my gifted and hilarious daughter. Our interaction blesses and challenges me daily. And then he quotes Catherine, I need to come in here and right the ship once in a while. And then he praises her mother and me for raising such a remarkable young woman.
He says, congratulations to you and Etta and to Catherine for running with and building on your best.
Oh, my. That was a beautiful letter, of course.
Yeah, and
we've gotten quite a bit on those programs.
You're blushing, but I wanted you to read that. Then there's another one right below that from Brad Moore. I had so much fun in this show. 1969, we talked to President Jefferson about 50th anniversaries. In 1969, we talked to him about Woodstock, and he famously said that he hoped the women were properly escorted and properly clad. Do you recall?
Well, yeah, Mr. Jefferson was concerned that there might be some nudity.
Uh-huh. And I don't know if you can confirm this comment or not. Would you like to read this letter?
This is a comment on your interview with Mr. Jefferson contained in the 1969 episode. Mr. Jefferson once remarked that the University of Virginia would admit women when a man walked on the moon. Ever sagacious, Mr. Jefferson's assertion proved correct. The university's first female undergraduates matriculated in 1970, Mr. Jefferson's prerequisite having been satisfied. I can't confirm that is what Jefferson actually said, but it certainly covers his view that women should be educated up to a certain point, but at about the age of 9, they should turn off from the standard curriculum into home economics, that their life would be lived as mothers and in the nursery and running the kitchen and plucking chickens and so on. Jefferson was certainly locked into a certain patriarchal view of things. I think if he could see today what women are achieving in this culture. And the other thing that really struck me is my daughter and I had these great conversations in London and at Oxford, where she's now a graduate student at Hartford College in early modern history. And we were talking about things that go wrong. And we both concluded, you know what? It's almost always men. It's almost always males. Most of the troubles in the world are males. Very few of the troubles of the world in public life, ethics violations, sexual predation, corruption, very few of these are women. Most of the trouble is from men. And so when you realize that, you think, thank goodness that there has been a gender revolution and that women are playing such a significant part in our public lives now. If we had a Senate that contained only women, it would be a much better Senate than the one that we have.
You think?
I think, yes, without question.
Back to 1969, there's a couple of letters here about some comments you made about moon landings. Question for Clay, what's your beef about Gene Cernan?
Oh, yes.
I finished The Last Man on the Moon recently myself, but other than his macho flight pilot mentality, I found no significant issues with the guy or the book. Am I missing something? Love the show, Mike. And that's from Mike Bond.
Well, I've read all of these memoirs, and I find them all fascinating, including Gene Cernan, who was actually the last man to walk on the surface of the moon. I found the book off-putting, Last Man on the Moon. I found his self-love, he was settling some scores with other astronauts, which I thought was unseemly. It just seemed to me that there was too much attitude and too little delivery of the sense of wonder.
You were kind of hard on the guy, if I remember correctly.
I don't mind being hard on him.
What if he was a friend of mine?
Tough. Go read the book.
Well, Gary Gilbert's wrote it. And he said, by the way, while we were at it, Gene Cernan, the last man on the moon, was my friend. His given name is Eugene, but he always preferred Gene. You said you don't like him. Reading one little book does not make you a man's qualified evaluation authority. You have no idea of who he is. How dare you?
Well, it goes on. I mean, he's obviously upset. It signs it tough love, but I have never missed an episode. I'm so concerned for you, my friend. You are better than what has been coming out of your mouth. Your frustration is overflowing. It appears that you have drank the big government Kool-Aid made with the water from the swamp on the hill. Aim higher. Well, I guess we know his politics.
Well, he's got a place here too, and I don't know because I have not read the book, so I can't make any judgment.
These are two different questions. So Gene Cernan, I haven't listened to what I said, but it sounds like it was extreme. So I think civility requires me to say I'm sorry for that. He's a hero. He did something amazing. Only 12 people have walked on the surface of the moon. That's automatic respect as far as I'm concerned. As to where we are, this is just such a vexed question. I wish we weren't in this crisis. I don't like what's coming out of my mouth. I write these things because I feel so strongly about them. I feel like the very future of our republic is at stake. And I don't want to. I just want to be cheerful and talk about Jefferson and wine and Jefferson and library classification and Jefferson and agriculture. But I feel like you can't be doing this. You can't say that you're committed to the world that Thomas Jefferson wanted to see and then be cheerful about the super partisanship that is dividing this country and the gridlock and paralysis, and now the impeachment crisis that we're in, including a whopping constitutional crisis. I simply ask people to do two things: to realize that I don't say what I'm saying lightly. I'm not just shooting off my mouth, I hope. And secondly, that I feel I have a duty to Thomas Jefferson, to history, and to the Constitution, and to due process to say when I think that things are appallingly out of balance, and I do.
That letter was from Gary Gilbert's. Gary, I hope I represented you properly. And with that, sir, we need to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week we are joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and we are answering listener mail, something we probably don't do enough. And you have a stack of letters in front of you, and you've picked one out from Amy Jo Townley.
I'm very much taken with this letter. Let me just read it in its entirety. I've repeatedly heard Clay cite the large societal swings that have occurred in the last few decades and then appeal for patience from those of us who are impatiently awaiting further change. Clay wants us to give the non-minorities an opportunity to get used to the changes that have occurred. As a member of two oppressed classes, female and LGBTQ, I must protest. The changes we are trying so desperately to enact are what should have been the default in the first place. Why on earth would we patiently wait for our oppressors to get on with the program, as it were? Clay, if you were to wake up tomorrow morning to discover you were considered a second-class citizen because of your gender, skin color, and or sexuality, you would find it preposterous. White men would be beside themselves if they were to wake up in our circumstances. Patience is not the answer. We're lucky if we spend an average of 80 years on this planet. We do not have the luxury of patience. Straight white males should not have the luxury of ignorance. All I can say is I agree with this. Of course, when I'm saying things either as Jefferson or sometimes as myself, David, I think how easy it is for me to say these things about patience, and we will get through this, and politics is the art of the practical.
But then when you're stuck in the middle of it,
and I do feel, so let me try to be clear here. I do feel we need to understand the rage that has poured out of a certain part of the American electorate over the pace of change and its fear-driven desire to cling to or return to a previous paradigm. I feel that you can't understand where we are unless you try to come to terms with that it deserves respect and even sympathy, but we shouldn't say we'll rest there. I agree with Amy Jo Townley that these are questions of great urgency, particularly if you're one of the oppressed and not a privileged white male, as I have been all of my life. However, I want to believe that the American people are better than they seem, that we're closer to consensus than might appear, and that there is that civility and patience and tolerance and mutual respect and disagreeing as rational friends is the way to move forward. I think if you look at it from a sociological or historical point of view, when cultures change very fast, as we have been, there is almost always a bitter conservative reaction, whether it's from the left or the right, that the pace is overwhelming our capacity to come to terms with it. And I think that when that happens, terrible things can occur, including violence. And so it's not that I'm a gradualist, because I'm a Jeffersonian. I believe that in radical change. But I also believe that this urgency, the fierce urgency of now, as Martin Luther King put it, has to be aware of how cultures actually do change, that they can't shrug and change, they have to agonize and change. I hope that makes sense, but I agree with everything she said. I quoted her letter verbatim. There's no way that I can challenge that, and it only makes me blush to think that as a privileged white male, I can say these things as if I know what I'm talking about.
We do not have the luxury of patience. That's the line that sticks out to me, and I'm very glad you picked out this letter. I'm glad that we addressed it. It's an incredibly important issue, and again, if you're not a privileged white male as we are. Jefferson didn't write persons, he wrote all men are created equal. Do you think he would have changed that in our day?
Yes, of course, because we got through that. Remember in the 1980s, we agonized, do I have to say he and she? Can I say there? When I say men, I mean universal.
Patience.
We got through it. And we've now changed our gender designations in a smart way.
We do not have the luxury of patience, but if you look at the rapidity of change that has existed during our lifetime, I mean, it's certainly not there yet, but there's been a lot of forward progress.
I'll tell you what, if I were a Muslim American at this moment, I would be terrified, or a Muslim visitor to this country. I think that we have allowed an outpouring of hate and xenophobia that may exist in the human condition, but which is now in one of its spiking moments, and that this is dangerous because it encourages others who are fearful, and it may precipitate violence, and it is so antithetical to everything that this country stands for. And of course that applies to all minorities. So when Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, we know that this now has to be read in a universalist way, and that discrimination, you can discriminate between a North Dakotan and a Minnesotan because of their zip codes. There are legitimate discriminations that can be made. But what we have failed to understand is that the human condition is a universal, and all those discriminations have been social constructs rather than born in nature. And we've made the mistake, bigots make the mistake of thinking those discriminations are born in nature, when in fact they're constructs of privileged classes through history. And undoing all this, post-colonialism, post-apartheid, post-Jim Crow, post-separate but equal, all those undoings of these deeply embedded discriminatory structures in the culture is going to take a long, long time. So if you say, patience, easy to say, But if you're on the other side of that divide, I think of these of these people in the African American community who've come forward and said, and these are prominent African Americans, and say, I've been stopped by police 17 times in the last 4 years for driving my car. I had a friend in Colorado who was an African American photographer. He said he'd been going to the same bank for 17 years. Every time he went in, they asked for his ID, but not other people who were coming in. And that he'd be saying, don't you know me after 17 years? But they would single him out. There was profiling. And I think every human being is capable of this sort of unthinking response to the other, capital O. All of us. Well, maybe not all of us. I certainly. And we educate ourselves to overcome it. We read literature to overcome it. We educate ourselves. We learn to disagree as rational friends to overcome it. We travel to overcome it. We put ourselves in slightly risky circumstances to overcome it. But our duty is to rise out of whatever software was implanted in us by our place and by our family and the circumstances of our childhood, and to try to see the world in a wider, richer, more nuanced, more generous way. And none of us gets very far, David. I'm 60-some years old, and I think, why am I not farther along in these questions? Why, my daughter is a great challenge to this. She'll say, Dad, I know what you're saying, and what you're saying has some legitimacy to it, but people we don't really talk that way anymore. And I'm always surprised, like, because I was really just trying to be a rational human being, and she's saying, no, there's a lingering echo of a previous worldview that's still creeping around in your discourse sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up.
It really upsets me when she says it, but she's right.
But doesn't it give you hope?
I never lash out at her. I think, tell me, keep me posted.
Yeah, doesn't that give you hope for the future?
Yes.
We go back to Jefferson. All men are created equal. We still get letters from people. In fact, there's one in here about, how can you talk about Jefferson and agriculture when he was a slave owner? That sort of tack. But I don't, you tell me if I'm off base, but I don't look at Jefferson saying all men are created equal as him recognizing a state of things. I recognize that as Jefferson doing what he did best for us, which is giving us something to aspire to.
I agree with that. And if you asked him, if he were here, and you could get truth serum in him and say, when you wrote all men are created equal, did you believe that African Americans were in that sentence?
He would say no.
He would say, he might say, I never really thought about it that way, because what he really meant was all of us, but then he would say, well, of course it extends to African Americans. But I don't think that his mindset, I wrote this was in a Jefferson Watch, I think a week or so ago. He was able to put things in different boxes in his soul, in his heart, in his brain, and they didn't trip him up much. There's a form of genius in that. But you could also say, look, if you're going to say, how can we take the University of Virginia seriously when it was created by slaves? How can we take the terrace of the gardens at Monticello seriously when they were built by slaves? How can we, if you go down that path, there's no end to it. What could you say that Jefferson did or achieved in the course of his lifetime that wasn't predicated on a plateau of enslaved people? You can't even contemplate Jefferson's life without slavery, because it was inextricably interwoven into every aspect of his life. And so you could say, and I say this to myself at 2:00 in the morning frequently, I just want Amy, Joe, and others to know I don't say any of these things without great self-scrutiny and agony at times. And I have said, shocking some people, that once every 3 or 4 months I think I just got to get out of the Jefferson business altogether, because he's such a problematic figure in some respects. And I mean it. It's created a crisis for me, because we're so much more aware today than we were in 1940. And we have different ways of seeing, and they are almost on the whole infinitely more welcoming and generous than those that we had back in my grandparents' day. But then I think, well, wait a minute. You don't really want to dismiss Jefferson out of hand once and for all forever and just erase him from from American memory. A, we need him. B, that way madness lies. I mean, almost everybody. I'm gonna be erased in my tiny little chalkboard. We're all going to be erased because we carry with us the echoes of an illiberal past.
We carry with us
the echoes of an illiberal past.
That's a good self-realization that I'm going to try to hang on to.
And so, what's the wise, enlightened, and humble way to look at this? I don't know. You could say, we can't take seriously as a lover of human possibility a man who could cheerfully live with 200 slaves and 600 or more in the course of his lifetime. We just can no longer take that seriously. And that would be a legitimate thing to say. Or we could say, we're going to condemn Jefferson for all of the weaknesses and blindnesses and bigotries in his life, but we're going to try to understand that that's not the whole Jefferson, that there is some Jefferson that's intrinsically valuable in spite of that, just as what a poet says today is intrinsically valuable if she or he is flying in an airplane to give a reading at a conference, knowing what we now know about the planet and carbon. Not that I put these in the same category, by the way. I don't know the answer to these questions, but I love that Amy Jo Townley listens to the program, that she took the time to write, that she wrote unhesitatingly and without giving us a pass.
Yeah, she
and
did.
That we're having a conversation because of the strength, articulateness, civility, and firmness of her letter. I'm so confused about life. I don't know about you, but there is very little that doesn't confuse me now in life.
Well, I'm looking through the mail, and the letter I referenced was from Dustin Hyman. Dustin, he wrote, how when asked about the president's relationship to the economy on your show, does this Jefferson not mention slavery? You can talk about agrarian ideals and peaceful farming all you want, but the real Jefferson owned 600 slaves over the course of his lifetime. Not mentioning this during a conversation about the economy is disgusting and dangerous. And he listens on 91.5 KRCC on the radio. Dustin, I don't know if you listen to the show on a regular basis, and perhaps this doesn't satisfy your argument, but that subject comes up a great deal. And when Clay is in character as Mr. Jefferson, he speaks as Mr. Jefferson. And I doubt Mr. Jefferson would ever acknowledge that this is what you refer to as disgusting and dangerous. So I hope this previous conversation helps answer that question for you.
Well, we almost need a little bell that comes off at 1 minute into every Jefferson hour that just says this.
Yeah.
Just says this. Stop, everyone. We acknowledge that slavery is the fundamental problem of Thomas Jefferson's life, and it taints almost everything that he said and did.
I know you've told this story at least a half a dozen times over the course of my tenure on the show. I'm going to ask you to do a real condensed version of it again. It was a time when you were out shopping or in a public place, there was a radio on.
It was here in Bismarck,
and you heard yourself not recognizing yourself.
I was living in Reno, Nevada. I came here to give a talk about something else, and it was a Sunday. I was waiting for an airplane. Barnes & Noble wasn't open, so I stopped into this coffee shop on the main street. You know, the one I'm talking about in Bismarck, and there were like 7 or 12 people there, and they were listening to something. And so I went up and got my latte, and I'm kind of, how you kind of half aware of what's going on. And then I heard this guy saying that African Americans were, we aren't sure, but maybe they're, and I thought, what kind of a miserable bigot do they got on this?
Yeah, who would broadcast this?
Yeah, then I thought, oh my goodness, it's me. And I slunk out of there. I mean, if I could have slithered on the floor like a reptile, I would have.
So the point of this is that when you are Jefferson, and I will stand up for you, when you are Jefferson, you are Jefferson.
Well, I'm trying to be
Something
Jefferson.
happens and you become Jefferson, and you don't sugarcoat it. And we get praise for that for you, too. You become Jefferson, warts and all.
Well, I worry about this because I think people have heard me say this too once or twice in the course of this long run of Jefferson hours, that you only get you have X number of heartbeats in life, and you have X number of breaths that you're going to take, and that means X number of words can come out of your mouth. I mean, it's really that case. So you can either be Paul McCartney and say all you need is love, or you can be something else. You could be speaking the way George Wallace spoke during the 1960s. Segregation now, segregation forever. You need to monitor what comes out of your mouth, because you only get a few sentences, and you'd better make sure you're not adding to the problem. And sometimes when I'm Jefferson,
you are.
That's why, and I'll tell you what, I invented this for Chautauqua. This is my gift to historical impersonation. When we started this in North Dakota in the 1970s, I said, we will always break character. We will always break character so that you can say, what I've been saying was a historical statement by somebody who lived.
And that's the format of the show,
right,
too.
and you must break character. And that's why we do it, is because there at least has to be a counter voice in the same hour of discourse.
Great letter. We have to thank her again for sending that in. It was a pleasure to listen to you answer that.
I'm depressed to think that I don't want to feel sorry for myself, but I've spent my life trying to speak on behalf of an enlightened world worth living in, and to think that I sometimes upset people by either being lukewarm on things that they're passionate about, or having these echoes of a previous worldview. It's very upsetting to me.
It's that scene from what was the movie with Nicolas Cage and Cher?
I have no idea.
Oh, it's Moonstruck, and Nicolas Cage's character is telling Cher's character how much he loves her, and she can't handle it, and she slaps him across the face and says, "Snap out of it."
That's very Cher-like. I wish you were here now. She'd be slapping me around.
There are those of us who appreciate what you do endlessly, sir. And with that, we are going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, agonizing over some of the discourse that comes out of my mouth.
I've been really hard on you this week. I know you can take it, and maybe that's why I have, but I'm going to give you the last really tough love letter this week.
Let's hear it.
It came from Scott Blake. And
I've got it right in front of me.
After hearing your recent discussion on Humboldt and Jefferson, I read it and was very disappointed, he says. He didn't think there was anything really substantial on the relationship between the two. And said another reviewer on Amazon mentioned that a better look at Humboldt is The Invention of Nature. And I think we would both agree with that.
Of course. Humboldt and Jefferson, I think, is a good book. I think we both liked it when we read it. But it's not as much about Humboldt and Jefferson as you might have hoped. Mm-hmm. And it misses some important stories, which I think we brought into the program that we did. Andrea Wolf's The Invention of Nature is a great book. She's outstanding in everything that she does. So fair enough. And let me say something about all of this, David. It's the free marketplace of ideas. The fact that people listen and sometimes disagree violently or sharply, who write us and tell us what they think, who say that's not the best book, there's a better book, or the way you handled that was inept. This is the free marketplace of ideas. This is good. It's good that there is room in our culture for this kind of disagreement. It's not, think of what you hear when there's, say, on MSNBC or on Fox, when there's a critic, that kind of just savagery. Oh, they're full of beans. How dare you? I can't believe. That's not a free marketplace of ideas. Obviously, we feel strongly about the things we feel strongly about, and that's good. But we can be civil, and we must have our – I can't tell you how many times in the last 2 years I've had to look in a metaphoric mirror and realize, oh my, I need to think again about this. Or I'm not so sure about this. You know what? I even feel this about the constitutional impeachment crisis. I'm trying to listen to everybody,
Yeah.
I
good.
think some people fault me for that. I mean,
I would not. I do too.
I try to listen to everybody, and I try to figure out
And
what part of me responds to
Keep your
this.
mind open to the fact that you might be wrong.
I'm often wrong, clearly. And here's one, I'll tell you an easy one.
Okay.
This is from Greg Sund.
Oh, I love this one.
For the last couple of weeks, there's been mention of hot air balloons operating on hydrogen. This is incorrect. Hot air balloons are lifted by hot air, not hydrogen. One else only to attend to the many hot air balloon festivals in the U.S. to observe. Well, of course, today we use hot air. In Jefferson's time, they were using.
You ever been up in a hot air balloon?
Yes, many times.
Oh, they're great.
Well,
Yeah.
5 times. How about you?
Tom Tollefson in Fargo has taken me up and flown over the Badlands.
I've been at the Albuquerque Balloon Festival and the Reno Balloon Festival.
That's great fun. Those are hot air.
Those are hot air.
Yeah.
But in Jefferson's time, they were using hydrogen.
Really?
And they did sometimes burn. Explode.
There's records of this, I'm assuming.
Yes. But, helium was not yet, there was no way to pull helium out of the larger structure of air at the time. Anyway, Greg Sund is right.
KRCC, Colorado Springs.
And so thank you very much. And we love that sort of thing.
Yeah.
First of all, there's so many things that I know nothing about, and I try to know something about them through the voice and lens of Thomas Jefferson. But even then, I'm struck again and again by how little I know, and
Well, I would not put
right?
it that way. It's just that there is always something new to learn about Jefferson. He left so much.
Well, you need that little earpiece that you see like on news anchors where
Yeah.
they're saying, and it was a B-52, and then they hear, excuse me, it was a B-34, and someone in the back room is like fact-checking.
Yeah.
We need that because I'm a writer now. I'm writing these books, and you write and you realize you're almost taking everything you say on faith from somebody else. So, for example, how many miles are there on a railroad track in this country? Well, I have no way of knowing. How would I know? I'm not going to measure them. So I have to count on somebody that's reliable to tell me that thing. And it turns out that even reputable historians are often wrong about such things, and then the errors get repeated and repeated. If let's just say that there were this thing.
But this age we live in is far improved than, say, 100 years ago.
You can fact check better today.
Yeah.
But let's say that you and I and everyone listening has a chip installed in your throat, and you could never say another thing that you couldn't verify.
That would be a good book. That would be an excellent book. You should hang on to that.
What could I say that I can verify?
Recently, you talked about some new friends that you had made. You were very excited in Georgia.
Yes, yes.
Yes. And we got a letter from Gregory Starks.
Oh, yes.
And he said, you said on a podcast open this week that you were coming back to Georgia. Are you doing a public appearance? If so, when?
I did another one. There will be more.
Sorry, Greg.
But that moment has come and gone. But I would come back any time to Georgia.
Yeah, you had a great time down there.
And then I went to Thomasville, which is this lovely kind of retirement resort place near Tallahassee. I love Georgia, and I would spend more time there. And of course, Georgia's the home of the greatest living former president, Mr. Jimmy Carter, who's now 137 years old.
You see him the other day? He fell and injured himself.
But then he still built
the
a house.
The next day, he was out doing Habitat for Humanity. That's a great organization.
He's a great man.
Which I support. We got one from Scott Blake about a book, and I'm wondering if you are aware of this book. It's Theodore Roosevelt for the Defense. He just finished reading it.
Yes, I read it. It's good. It's about the Burns trial. So Roosevelt, after his presidency, accused this man Burns of being a corruptionist and so on, which he was. And so he sued Roosevelt for libel. And the trial took place up in Syracuse. It was a big deal because if Roosevelt lost, it would ruin his reputation and it might bankrupt him. It was a big deal. Roosevelt wound up winning. It's a funny story in many respects because when he got on the stand, he started telling stories about his life as a cowboy in the West and his life in Cuba and climbing the Matterhorn on his honeymoon and being police commissioner of New York. The judge kept admonishing him, saying, "You got to stick to the trial here." Colonel Roosevelt, and Roosevelt couldn't. Everyone, like people would get line up for hours to try to get into the courtroom to listen to Roosevelt hold forth because he was just so utterly fascinating. Well, in the end, he won the libel case, and it in many respects vindicated his life as a reformist. It's a really good book.
Well, he refers to it as delightful.
Is that from the same Scott that was upset with us on other questions?
I'm not sure.
What page is this?
That he is on page 6.
It is, yeah. This is. Thank you, Scott. Yes, this is
a delightful. You are there. Look at TR.
It's a great book, and here's one fascinating part of it. So, it's about to go to the jury, and that's when the Lusitania was sunk. And many people on the jury several were German Americans. And so Roosevelt's handler said to him, this is the Barnes trial, they said to him, for once in your life, keep your mouth shut. If you say anything about this thing, you might lose the case, and that would be cataclysmic. And so he immediately goes out and says to the world that he condemns what the Germans did with the Lusitania, and he went farther. And he said, because the Germans had put ads in American newspapers saying, the Lusitania is carrying armaments. We strongly urge Americans not to take this sea voyage on the Lusitania because it's fair game. So they were warning that they were going to torpedo this boat. And so they did. And more than 100 Americans died. It was carrying armaments. And Roosevelt said, if I had been president, when they put those ads in the papers, I would have taken the entire German diplomatic delegation in this country, marched them down, and put them on that ship. I said, go ahead, sink it.
We're about out of time.
Clever man.
We have many letters left to answer, so you're off to France. And when you come back, let's talk about France and answer some more of these letters. But there's one more short one.
All righty.
And it comes from Ann Wolcott. And she has a simple question. May, how do I get on a waiting list for the winter retreat about space?
Lots of people want to be part of that. It's full, but there are people that have to.
Sorry, Ann.
No, but some people have to withdraw. If she goes to jeffersonhour.com/tours and just writes a note, our handlers who handle this sort of thing will put her on the waiting list, and we'll try to accommodate her. So yes, we will put her on the list, and if there's room, we'll do it. And if there's a lot of popular demand, we'll do that retreat again in a year's time or 2 years' time.
Safe traveling to you, sir. We look forward to hearing from you. And with that, sir, we need to bring this part of the conversation to a close because it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
I don't deserve to pretend to be Thomas Jefferson. Not only don't I speak and write French and Italian, but I have virtually none of Jefferson's famous organizational skills. My home library has more than 20,000 volumes now, and though I have a relatively logical library classification system, I have a hard time finding books that have been fetched up at some point and not returned to their proper places. I've taken tens of thousands of pages of handwritten notes in my lifetime, but I almost never consult them, essentially never consult them, and they are so haphazardly filed that it's easier just to start over. Jefferson had a rage for order almost unique in American history, and I'm at the other end of that spectrum. I'm with Lieutenant Frank Drebin in the Naked Gun series. Oh, there's the missing evidence in the Kellner case. He was innocent. To which his partner replies, Frank, he went to the chair 2 years ago. Oh. In Aesop's fable of the grasshopper and the ant, I'm the grasshopper. Life catches me off guard so often that it would be comic if it weren't so painful. A few days ago, I drove up to Fort Mandan on the Missouri River about 40 miles north of Bismarck. It was a stunning early fall day, October 7th. I'm writing a new book about North Dakota, and I wanted to work on a chapter entitled The Language of Cottonwoods. I spent a couple of hours sitting under the great trees, just drinking in the dance of the golden yellow leaves in a perfect shirt-sleeve afternoon. I had to fly to Chicago 2 days later for a single night, and after I got home, I intended to bring in all the hoses, make sure my snowblower started, and winterize my Steinbeck rig. You will remember that in a fit of sheer madness, I bought a used pickup over the summer and a modest, used Steinbeck-like truck camper, Rocinante. I've arranged with a rancher, who, by the way, is a vile barn denier, to park my rig in their giant rodeo barn for the winter. I intended to do that over the weekend. Then a blizzard appeared out of nowhere, closed all the schools and the interstate highway, and most of the flights were canceled in and out of Bismarck. In a career of more than 30 years of thousands of performances and an equal number of flights, I have never once missed a gig. This threw me into a scramble mode. I wasn't even sure I could get my car to the airport, assuming I could catch a flight. In the end, I made it to Chicago on time, though I was a nervous wreck by the time I had fought with gate agents, missed a connection, been the one standby person on the last seat on the last flight to Chicago, and I got home too, though I was assured that a second bigger blizzard was on its way. So my hoses are now buried in snow. I managed to get the snowblower started, essentially by pouring gas over its entire surface and throwing a match on it. I cleared my sidewalk so that my Hamiltonian neighbors don't rat me out to the city snow patrol. I tried to get my pickup to the side of my house where I had parked my camper on its stilts, but the snow was too deep and I got stuck. Really stuck. So I decided to winterize the rig on the spot and hope for a break in the weather when I return from France, which will be about November 2nd. By then it will indeed be winter, so the rig may spend the winter parked on the side of my house, not the end of the world, but not my well-laid plan either. To winterize an RV of any sort, you must drain all of its fluids. There is the freshwater holding tank, which can hold up to 30 gallons, the hot water heater, and the wastewater tank, one euphemistically called the gray line, and the other the black line. You do the math. Now it had frozen in my absence, so it was at least possible that I had burst all the pipes. The water heater is the most vulnerable unit in such a rig. As an RV neophyte, a pathetic RV rookie, a man with few mechanical skills, I had no actual idea about how to do any of these things. But I have friends who have the full panoply of practical life skills, including the barn denier, so I began to figure it out. Their derision was palpable, but the key to knowing me is that you can never be harder on me than I am on myself. I don't know about you, but I belong to the 3 trips to the hardware store tribe. No home project can ever be done with a single trip to Ace Hardware, or even 2. Whatever you buy is the wrong thing, or just one of several things you wind up needing, and no matter how helpful the helpful hardware man is, you have to be able to describe your dilemma if you expect him to solve it for you. So, all of this took 5 hours, when the barn denier would have accomplished it all in about 45 minutes. By the time I finished, I was physically and spiritually exhausted, and of course I have no idea whether I did things right, or whether I will be taking Rocinante in for extensive repairs come May, if we even have a thaw by May. My hands are now chapped, chipped, and numb, knuckles bloody. At one point I had to snake a socket wrench where it really should not have gone. Jefferson would have had a beef with the manufacturer, by which time it seemed to me that no rational being would travel in a Steinbeckian camper rig, that staying in hotels is underrated. So now I need to try to get my truck out of the snowbank, and I need to pack for France. Simplify, simplify, says my other hero Thoreau. When in my fit of madness I bought this rig, I had dreams of wandering about this great continent in search of America, of the joy and satisfaction of living on the road in a tiny space, of driving life into a corner and reducing it to its lowest terms. In my gauzy dream life, I failed to consider the following factors. Number 1, if you buy an RV, you have all the basic appliances of a house and you're going to have the usual maintenance issues. 2, even a modest rig like mine gets about 12 miles per gallon on the road, which means that my Thoreauvian pleasure is killing the planet Earth. 3, I'm gone so much of the time that I would have to be a super ant, not automatically to be a grasshopper instead. 4, in my suburban home, I really have no place to store an RV when it is not in use, and my barn denier friends are so selfish that they won't just drop everything on a moment's notice to accommodate my erratic whims. And 5, it is winter in North Dakota about 7 months per annum. By mid-afternoon today, I would have sold that rig for 10 cents on the dollar to anyone with a socket set and pink antifreeze you have to funnel into all the orifices of your Thoreauvian alternative home. I'm sure my spirits will recover in the south of France, where Jefferson, who called himself a mere orangutan, a creature of the sun, found renewal in 1787. But at the moment I am not feeling very Jeffersonian. From within my bruised grasshopper's exoskeleton, this project now seems to belong to the category of, at the time, it seemed like a good idea. You know what Kerouac said, The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing but burn, 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 burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles, exploding like spiders across the stars, and in the middle you see the blue center light pop, and everybody goes, ah. Send me gas cards. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.